India will take over the G20 presidency from 1st December at a time of great geopolitical and economic uncertainty. Plans are afoot to hold over 200 meetings across 20 Indian cities over a one-year period, which will culminate in the G20 Leader Summit in New Delhi in September next year. The big idea would be to promote brand India and its tourism potential to the world. Among India's priorities during the G20, addressing concerns on high inflation and recession, resuscitating sustainable development goals, showcasing India's digital infrastructure, lifestyle for environment, stability of food, fuel and fertilizer supply chains, consensus on debt relief will be among some of the key areas that will be discussed and deliberated upon over the next 1 year. I'm now joined by Ambassador Mohan Kumar, former chairman of Research and Information System for Developing Countries, also the Dean for O.P. Jindal Global University, and Shombi Sharp, UN Resident Coordinator in India. Ambassador Sharp, if I can begin with you, give us a sense of what the UN would be really expecting India to do during its presidency of the G20.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, Mr. Luthra, for inviting me to the program. It's a pleasure to join you here. And I think that I would like to say it's no secret that this G20 comes at a time of great turmoil. The country is facing the ongoing triple planetary crisis, the impacts of the Ukraine war, as was mentioned in the introduction, crises in terms of food and fertilizers and debt crises and such. So I think that actually India is, in fact, possibly the best placed country to take on such a challenge at this moment in time. India having bridges of trust and goodwill really perhaps in more directions than any other country that I can think of. So it's not going to be easy by any means, but we are optimistic that India will be able to build consensus on key issues that will help get us through this really, really difficult period and unpredictable period coming ahead. So, for example, the consensus that we need globally, and the G20, of course, being home to 80% of GDP globally, as well as 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. We need consensus in the G20 countries, first of all, on financing and technology for climate action. And climate action is both, of course, mitigation, and importantly, as India has strongly reinforced the message, on adaptation, on helping those communities, especially in lower and middle income countries who are suffering the most from the impacts of climate change. Collective action on the SDGs. The Secretary General of the UN has been ringing the alarm bell that the SDGs are in crisis. We need a rescue plan. For the first time, we're sliding backwards, first because of COVID and now these new crises, including the Ukraine war. So we need a rescue plan, and we know that India is placing, the Prime Minister has placed a high priority on investing in the SDGs, as he mentioned in Bali. Debt sustainability, the debt crisis is impacting a number of countries across the world, and we need to try to forestall increasing debt defaults and other implications of that. Digital public goods, again, to drive development at scale. And here, India also has been a leader in that space. Just energy transition would be my last point. Again, noting that we have to, as a world, move from polluting carbohydrate-based economic activity to clean energy. And here again, India is leading both in terms of the prioritization of G20, but also the evidence here in India in terms of massive investments in renewable energy, green hydrogen, and other forms.
Okay, so thank you for putting the expectations of the United Nations from India during the presidency of the G20. Mr. Sharp, I'll request you to continue being with us. I'll get an Ambassador Mohan Kumar at this point. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, RIS, the organization which you were heading till about 2 months back, is closely associated with the Indian government. They will be organizing the inaugural event at the G20 Secretariat tomorrow that will have an outreach to about 75 universities across the country. Would it be right to say that India wants to send a message about its tourism potential, highlight its achievements, highlight its economic potential to the world, promote brand India to the world through the G20?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I certainly think what both of you said in terms of what the G20 holds for India is correct. So I don't have anything to disagree with what you have said. As you rightly said, we're going to have an outreach on universities. So it's a case of showcasing the higher education opportunities in India. So we will try and do two things, frankly. One, I think we will have to be the voice of the global south for sure. I think there is no question that we will have to be the voice of the global south. And second, we will have to, as you rightly said, also try and see build brand India and showcase India's potential. Now, this essentially means that in terms of representing the voice of the global south, we will have to focus on food security, inflation, and other things in terms of what the global south is facing as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine. The good news is that there has been a joint declaration from Bali. It's got a paragraph on Russia and Ukraine. So if nothing else changes, we have a template by which to cover the Russian war in Ukraine. I think it is the other areas that will really demand the focus of India. One, as my co-panelist said correctly, will be climate change. And we've just off from COP27, but there are issues of climate finance. There are also issues, for example, of the loss and damage fund that has been recently set up. India would like to be the voice of those countries which are climate vulnerable. But as you rightly said, India will also take the
Right.
opportunity to have as many as 200 different events all over India, so that not just Delhi will merely be the culmination of the
Yeah.
summit in September next year, but I think they will take the G20 to different parts of the country. That is my assessment.
Right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, on the issue of debt relief, how challenging would it be to move forward from the discussions at Bali and come to some sort of consensus?
Well, I think Bali has got us started with the process. It's going to be a difficult process, I think, because the developed countries have not yet met the objective of $100 billion to be transferred to developing countries from 2020 to 25. That figure has not been met yet. But I think there will be more traction when it comes to really vulnerable countries wanting loss and damage. I think we are looking at countries like Maldives, Seychelles, Pakistan. I think those countries will have a better say. So I am optimistic about India's role in nudging forward those countries which have an obligation to help the climate vulnerable country. So I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think the G20
Okay.
summit in Delhi can make a valuable contribution in this regard.
Right. Mr. Sharp, talking about the geopolitical consequences, the humanitarian consequences of the war in Ukraine, this continues to rage on. The UN Secretary General has been calling for negotiations to bring peace, to end this war. He's been calling on all the parties. He's even urged India to play a greater role in terms of bringing peace. Even though bilateral issues, security issues don't really come up, but how can India play a role in minimizing the impact of the conflict, bringing peace to the region?
Well, exactly. As you said, the G20 itself is not a security platform per se. But as my co-panelists already noted, there was a very important result in the communique coming out of Bali, which did, in fact, echo the words of Prime Minister Modi that this is not an era for war. So we do see clearly the importance of positions of consensus being taken at the G20 as a platform. So I think that importance will carry forward as the war in Ukraine unfortunately continues. The Secretary General, of course, has called for all parties for ceasefire, immediate ceasefire, to be able to deliver sufficient humanitarian aid to those suffering in Ukraine. But as we've discussed and as we know, the impact has been global. And again, my co-panelist rightly pointed out that it's largely the developing world, in fact, the G77, the Global South, who are actually feeling the pain the most. And I mean, the world is feeling the pain. We know that Europe is, and North America, high-income countries, from these price rises and supply shocks. But it's really the poorer countries, and India has for a long time been a leading voice for the Global South. And so I think this is really where the G20, India's leadership is so important, because India is very much focused on the urgency for the world to come together, for the high-income countries to come together, to put in the financing, to help put in the financing, for example, the loss and damage fund that was mentioned, to build resilience to climate impacts, but also to insecurities. The number of people, food insecure people in the world, 350 million about, is double that from the pre-COVID time frame. So I think that mitigating the impacts is key. Yes.
All right. Yes, we've got you back on now.
Sorry, maybe I missed a
Ambassador
question.
Kumar, over the next... Yes, I'm coming back to you. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, give us a sense of how the issue of terrorism will play out during G20, bringing the perpetrators of 26/11 to book, stopping state-sponsored terror, terror financing. How important will these issues be during India's G20 presidency?
Well, I think there are two ways to go, and I hope India takes the latter route. The first route would be to have a boilerplate declaration on terrorism where everybody subscribes to anti-terrorism like they subscribe to motherhood and apple pie, and then we all forget about it. I hope the G20 summit in Delhi will go a little bit deeper on the issue of terrorism. As you rightly said, we should focus on financing of terrorism. We should not shy away from looking at the inability of the UN Security Council to name the terrorists, to list the terrorists, and a little bit try to put, shall we say, the shamefaced test on developed countries and other countries so that there are no double standards on terrorism. So it's easy to have a boilerplate declaration, and I think we will have that. But I am suggesting to you that we go one step further, maybe take the G20 Sherpas to the Taj Mahal Hotel in Mumbai, point out how difficult it was for the survivors. So those are the kind of things which I think we can impress on the G20 countries, that there's nothing like good terrorists and bad terrorists.
Right. Mr. Sharp, my final question to you. The concerns over resilient supply chains, resiliency of supply chains of food, energy, and fertilizers, that is a big concern for every country right now. What can be done over the next 1 year during the G20? Can we make some headway on having resilient supply chains so that there are no shocks related to food, energy, and fertilizers?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is the urgency of the moment, and I think you know, the UN, the Secretary General, has been guiding the UN system in trying to find those opportunities. For example, the Global Crisis Response Group, which has been at the core under the SG's leadership, together with other countries, trying to, in the first instance, unblock supply of some commodities, food grains, for example, and edible oils and such. So, you know, that's the first step. Beyond that, I think is, you know, critically important to help unblock financing so that countries are able to procure the food that they need. And this is where we really need, and I believe India's leadership is very much focused on this point. We need to take a look at the global development financing architecture and really you know, unpack and say, is it really servicing the needs that we have now, in particular poorer countries, or are there measures that we can take to help increase liquidity, reduce you know, capital adequacy ratios, this sort of a thing, so that countries are not faced with this terrible choice, which is, do you put food on the table for your people and not pay your debts, or can we possibly, you know, do both at the same time, so that we all get through this together. And I think that's a really important avenue, and India is definitely placing a high priority on that.
All right. All right, Mr. Shah, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, thank you very much for joining us on this broadcast, summing up what India's priorities can be and should be during the G20 presidency starting tomorrow. We're going to take a short break, but when we return, an